Hi everyone, I'm Jaclyn Marino, and to be honest, I picked this person because I was curious about influential female economists. So I looked for a list of female economists and there was a long list. So today I'm going to talk about the economist Elinor Ostrom. She became the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. And her research was pretty interesting. She focused on how people share and manage common resources like forests and water systems, fisheries, farmland. Elinor and other economists refer to this as the commons. A lot of economists believed that these shared resources would go overused and become overused unless the government or private companies controlled them instead of the people. But Ostrom studied real communities and showed that people would work together to manage those shared resources successfully. I thought that was interesting because I thought that sounded or reminded me a bit, there was a parallel there to social anthropology in a way. There were some, she's looking at communities, she's looking at social rules, so she took kind of like an interdisciplinary approach to her studies. As far as the social environment during her time affecting her intellectual contribution, she was born in 1933, so she lived through the Great Depression and World War II, which I would imagine would astronomically impact your life. But then later in her career, especially from the 60s through the 90s, environmental issues became really important just around the world in general. But in 1962, there was a popular book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring, and this raised awareness about pollution. And then the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, which showed growing public concern about protecting the environment. The US government also created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and passed laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. So these events reflected increasing concern about, conservation and protecting natural resources. So super influential during her time and her studies. At this time and during her studies, there was a popular idea in economics called the tragedy of the commons. So going back to those common resources like water and fisheries and farmland. And this was based on the idea that shared resources would eventually be destroyed because people would act in their own self-interest. Her work was shaped by this idea, and she felt that instead of assuming people would fail to cooperate, she would study real communities, and then she found many examples of people creating rules and working together to protect those shared resources. So the social and political environment during their most significant contributions happened between the 70s and the 90s, and again during this time governments and international organizations were trying to figure out how to manage those national resources and still support economic development. Around the world, policymakers were working on problems with water systems and fisheries and forest management, especially in developing countries. So there was a lot of debate about which resources should be managed by the government, or should they be managed by private businesses or local communities. And many people believe that only governments or private ownership could restrict overuse of these resources. But her research showed that local communities would often manage resources effectively on their own, which then challenged those beliefs at that time. As far as normative motivations for Elinor Ostrom's interventions, she really wanted to understand how people cooperate and how societies can manage those shared resources in a sustainable way. And she believed it was more important to use real world examples instead of economic theory. And so her goal was to understand how institutions and rules can help communities protect resources over long periods of time, as opposed to being imposed on them and being managed by governments or what have you. She didn't argue that one system always works best, but she did show that different communities can and will create solutions that work for them. And her ideas continue to influence research today. Scholars use her work, economic scholars use her work to study economic protection, climate change, cooperation, water and forest management, international agreements about shared resources, and community-based conservation. She wrote a lot, but her most famous book was called Governing the Commons, and it was published in 1990, and it's still super important in economics and political science and environmental studies. So I thought she was pretty interesting, but there is a long list of influential female economists in case anybody's interested. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to your videos. Bye.